Welcome to the Call Center Crew Podcast, where we educate, empower, and help you execute in the everyday grind that is contact center. We bring you the expertise and success from industry professionals around the world. Listen in or watch weekly every Wednesday at callcentercrew.com. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Call Center Crew Podcast. This is your host, Landon Rich. I'm here in sunny South Jordan, Utah, with the one and only Bryce Hayes. Bryce, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Bryce is the SVP of Operations here at Telarus. You might have heard the buzz around the industry. Telarus recently acquired and is joining forces with Carrier Sales just down the street. So, Bryce, that's exciting news. I love that news.
We're thrilled by it. The folks at Carrier have done some absolutely amazing things, and we feel that both organizations coming together are certainly going to be a benefit to the partners who work with us and the channel, and we believe it's nothing but a win. Those folks are truly exceptional, so to combine forces certainly will be greater than the sum of our parts.
Definitely. That's great. Well, if you're listening to this, the audio version, please check us out, callcentercrew.com. You can find the video version as well as Call Center Crew across all those different social sites. So, Bryce, let's jump in. Today we're talking about outsourcing, right? As the listeners will hear and learn, you and I have some background, not together in outsourcing, but in outsourcing as a whole. So, Bryce, why don't you introduce yourself, kind of your background in outsourcing, how you came into the industry, and then how you led into the current role here at Telarus.
So I'm one of those strange outsourcing stories where I started from the ground up. So when I was going to college, I started with Sears Shop-at-Home catalog. So once upon a time when they used to print out the 900-page catalog, you had to call someone, and that was us. So when I was still relatively young, first real job, I worked in that Sears center, and people would call us and ask me questions about tools and healthcare products. A very strange combination of things, because usually the tools created the need for the healthcare products. I did that for a couple of years, and then when I finished school, I joined an organization here in Salt Lake City, which at the time was called Matrix Marketing. Matrix Marketing, for those of you in call center, ultimately became Convergys after several years. And then as they split off and grew and, quite frankly, exploded, there were a lot of opportunities that came up. So I've worked on accounts really across every vertical you can think of, from long distance once upon a time to internet to cell phones to credit cards to consumer electronics, travel, you name it. So I worked with the folks at Convergys for 10 years. And then I had an opportunity present itself to go to Manila in the Philippines, where I was the chief operating officer of a company there for a period of 5 years. And then that company acquired another organization in Illinois, and I was asked to move back to the U.S. and ran things there. And it's a lot of fun to go from the foreign side of things in call center world back to the U.S. and work with a domestic offering. And from there had some opportunities that presented themselves, where I ended up being president of a group that was led out of New York City. We had offices in Ireland, in France. We did a lot of work still in the Philippines, in India. It's been an incredible ride, but really for 20 plus years, I've had an opportunity to be on teams as an agent, lead teams. I've run training departments, operations departments. I think that anybody in call center learns how to do a little bit of everything, from installing a server all the way down to writing the first travel policy for the company.
Yep.
So when it comes to contact center, I consider that to really be my history, but over 20 years in the industry.
Excellent. And so now you're here back again in Utah, South Jordan. How'd you come to Telarus, and what do you currently do in your role as SVP of Operations?
So who would have thought coming back to Utah? I really didn't see that coming. Actually, I was in a bit of a break for a period of time and was looking around and stumbled across an ad on LinkedIn for Telarus. Telarus is a master agent in the telecom industry. And for those in call center, this will start to make sense. We, of course, bought switches, we bought equipment, we bought servers, we bought phones. The individuals who you buy them from, if you're not buying it directly from an Avaya or a Cisco or whoever it might have been at the time, Nortel, once upon a time, to date myself, you're usually buying from an agent who sells within a channel. And Telarus is an organization that supports all of these partners and aggregates the different telecom suppliers that they might use so that they can then put together a comprehensive offering for our partners. So we have partners across the country, and quite frankly, we can sell around the world, that put together these solutions. So maybe for a school or a hospital or whatever that looks like, we design that. We also work with a lot of contact centers who have the same questions of, I need to be able to field X amount of calls. I need this type of bandwidth. I'm looking for these type of phones. Maybe there's a question about, should I use a hosted solution? The way that contact centers, of course, have changed is that we've moved from that environment where, once upon a time, only very large, very rich companies could afford to have the infrastructure to do these things, to now a cloud technology. A company like Telarus helps people to engage with the latest technology and with these suppliers and bring everything together into one package to create a more successful outcome.
Excellent. You mentioned going from a hosted or a premise-based technology to the cloud. The listeners, we're going to have a separate episode specifically on going from premise to the cloud, and so that's the big talk, and that's the big shift in technology, right?
Certainly.
So taking a step back, outsourcing. So there's basically two types of call centers, right? If a large corporation may have an internal call center where they house they field all their own phone calls, they have their very own back office, they're doing emails, they're doing their own chats. Now stepping into the BPO world, or business processing outsourcing world, and how that relates to being an outsourcer in let's say in India or Philippines or near shore, Central America, El Salvador. What are some of the things that why would a company choose to house calls internally versus, let's say, outsource them overseas, near shore, offshore?
Well, the reality today, and it just as a little bit of a precursor to your question, any business, any entity that fields communication is a contact center. And so every business has looked to figure that out. And so whether you're, mom and pop's pizza shop, and when I was a kid, what you did is that you made a phone order in, you waited on hold for however long, or you got a busy signal. Mm-hmm. And slowly but surely they figured it out and said, well, we'll just add more phones. So I remember going into the pizza shop and there would be 10 phones ringing at any one time. Then they figured out, well, what if I only have a couple of phones, but I have phone lines, so that then I can get to them as quick as I can. Then they figured out over time, well, what if I were to get rid of the phones altogether and have people place these orders online, where now I don't need those 10 people who used to answer the phone. They can just send the order in, and now what I really need is cook. Which is their core competency.
Right.
I think that is the perfect type of analogy to figure out, why would you do this yourself, or why would you keep it in-house? As I worked with different outsourcers, there were varying degrees of success with implementations. And what was always very interesting to me is you would engage, especially in the early 2000s, with procurement groups. And procurement groups were built to get rid of the good old boy network, to ensure that they could negotiate, check all the boxes, and then get the lowest possible price for what those services looked like. And when people started to do that, they took a lot of the human element out of things. And as a result, when you then went to work with someone, you were already at a disadvantage because you'd already been cut about as severely as you could be cut. And right. Of course, contact center is already very commoditized. Let's be direct. Most contact centers look similar. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, when you just kind of are gashing all of these margins, at one point in time, it wasn't really built to be a consultative relationship, as opposed to, well, you're here to solve my problem. I could have found 10 other people to do it. You volunteered to do it the cheapest. Congratulations. Yeah. It's kind of a terrible place to be.
Yeah.
So when companies are now making the decision as to why they wouldn't outsource, I think things have changed a bit. Of course, people will start by saying it's cheaper, maybe it's more efficient. And I think that we've moved past that, thankfully, into a world of, does it make you better? At the very core of the argument, does it make you better? Now, for some companies, having the cash back makes them better. Mm-hmm. For some organizations, they'll look at it and say, we were never going to be able to respond to this number of people. And so we needed a company that had infrastructure, that had servers, that had people who knew how to go out and recruit 2,000 people, and then they could turn it around for us. But again, at the core, when you ask of what makes you better, you're trying to figure out and say, those things that you keep for yourself, there's some really clear reasons why you would not outsource. You're not going to outsource something that is overly volatile, or where you're putting the decisions of your company in the hands of another organization.
Right.
If somehow you've empowered the organization that you've outsourced to create your processes or design your systems, you're now stuck. They own your business. You'll never get out. And I've certainly seen over time, I've watched relationships where these people have, well, can you solve the problem? Can you come up with something? Well, who owns those systems? Who owns those platforms? Who owns the outline? Now, some people are better at contracts than others, and some people have found ways to keep that work product and kind of dedicate it to them. But, if it makes you better, if it allows you to focus on your core competency as a business, that allows you to go to the market. Apple, of course, utilizes outsourcers.
Right.
Apple's core competency is they innovate and they market and they excel. Having someone answer phone calls to tell them how to turn the iPod or the iPhone on and off is not outsourcing a core competency.
Right.
But if they were ever to go back through and all of a sudden they said, well, we need you to develop the next version of the iPhone and then come back to us when you're done, you probably have made a mistake.
Right.
As companies have looked at outsourcing, I think the conversation has now shifted into, can you, of course, handle that problem? Do you make us better? Is it a relationship we're able to grow with you and to expand the partnership? Does it allow us to focus on what we do best? And those organizations that have figured that out and have added to procurement an element of culture. We like each other. We can grow with you. We understand that you have the equipment and skills that you bring to the table. We have outlines and process that we bring to the table, and we'll work with you. Those are the successful relationships. For anybody who's worked in contact center, you're always thrilled to be able to go out and announce to the world, hey, we just signed 3,000 new sites of, or 3,000 new seats of this very large organization that's exploding.
Right.
And then people get in and they start to work with them and like, all right, these guys have boiled this down to the lowest common denominator. I'm not growing as an agent. It's miserable for me to work here. The companies, of course, are thrilled to have won that contract, but that doesn't ultimately make anybody better. And
Right.
those relationships, everybody's seen it. It's musical chairs, musical call centers.
Yep.
The company will bleed for so long and then figure out either that they've built a relationship of trust that they can then grow with, or at some point the procurement group steps back in and off it goes and it's with someone else.
Right.
I ask myself sometimes the question, and one of the negative things that happens in call centers is, do I have a partnership with you? Are you interested in helping me grow my business the way that I would like to help you grow your business? And if you're not having that conversation, you're a butt in a seat, that's a terrible place to be, because there's actually no margin in that.
Yeah. And that leads to many, many other problems. Taking a step over into the more operational side is, like you said, if you're just a butt in the seat, and you're tasking your agents to come in, clock in, take phone calls, and then see you later. Here's your paycheck. They're not, like you said, they're not growing. They're not developing. They don't feel value for them as an employee for you, the outsourcer, but they don't care about the phone call. They don't care about what they're providing for the customer experience, right, for the client. And so I think the relationship piece is very, very important.
I actually think it has moved, thankfully, to the core. And so as organizations have figured things out, I was with a group once upon a time. I'll date myself, but we were one of the very first outsourcers that had gone into the Philippines. And it was with a very large organization. And I think at the time we were doing work here in the U.S. for a set dollar amount. It was fairly high.
Mm-hmm.
So you used to be able to go out and sell this in the Philippines for 30, 40% less without naming dollar figures. And so when we had gone, or when this company had gone to negotiate this, they said, hey, we can save you $5 an hour if you go to the Philippines. Well, the reality at the time is they probably could have saved 20 if they would have priced it. So, of course, when that other organization figured out that, hey, my outsourcer just did me wrong, because, again, both companies were public,
Mm-hmm.
that was the exact same thing that outsourcers decry and say, look, you have to protect me, you have to help me. It wasn't a consultative relationship, and as soon as one party felt taken advantage of, that relationship was over.
Right.
And over time, it went away. So for somebody to make an extra X dollars per hour for another year, maybe I would have been happier taking less for
10 years,
a longer term relationship.
Exactly. Yep, exactly. So we've covered a few different things with why should somebody outsource, or why would a company need to outsource or want to outsource. So we talked about price just barely. Obviously, it's no mystery. The cost here in the United States obviously is a lot higher than let's say nearshore Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Mexico. Then also from there, taking one step further, is it's cheaper to go over offshore, right? Philippines, India. And so that's one reason why someone may want to or may look to outsource is cost. And like we just went through, sometimes cost isn't everything, though.
Well, there's a real question of, do people really know the variables of cost? So once upon a time, when I spent time in the Philippines from 2003 till 2008, everybody would look at it and say, well, it costs me this to hire in the U.S., and I can get that same employee in the Philippines for this. Mm-hmm. Well, that was true. But then you'd go back and you'd start to ask questions of, well, the connectivity is higher in the Philippines, or the relationship that I have to hire more people in the Philippines, or these folks in the Philippines. The original knock on the folks in Manila, right or wrong, and I think a lot of it's changed, was that a lot of training had to take place to minimize the accent, which sounds completely culturally inappropriate, but it was a problem in 2003. Decision-making was a question. And I think outsourcing agencies and organizations have done an amazing job of training that team to become what they've needed them to become. And the Filipino government and people have done an exceptional job of figuring out how to bridge that gap, and it's come together. But I've seen a lot of projects that go into play where there are costs that are not accounted for. So maybe there are costs in efficiency, that maybe you're not as fast as you used to be. So if somebody in the U.S. at one point in time could have answered that call in 5 minutes, and now it takes a half hour in the Philippines, you didn't save any money.
Right.
If somehow, because it now takes you longer to make those calls, you have to hire more people, that costs you more money. If then you have to add more bandwidth and had, again, back then, another T1 or 10, because you now need more agents to solve what people could before, then you've got a problem. People got really excited about the optics, and a lot of people didn't do their research. And there were a lot of organizations that came over, and the same thing happened in India, it happened in Costa Rica, it happened in the Honduras, where people got excited about the idea, but didn't connect all the dots.
Right.
And so there have been many that have been very successful. And over time, people have gotten really good at this. Now they can sit down and they can figure out all the costs. So anybody who has a car is familiar with the idea of cost of ownership. Is it cheaper for you to own this thing or lease it? And there's calculators online, and it tells you everything you need to know about how this works. And if you own the car, you'll have to replace the tires and do the oil changes. And if you lease it, you do this. People have now started to figure this out with contact center to then go back and check those variables again. But as a lot of these organizations are coming into play, you have your contact center experts, which you need to be that trusted advisor, and you need to believe them and trust them that they know what boxes to ask about. Because many companies, and especially those that are up and coming, didn't have contact center experts. That's why they're looking at you in the first place.
Right.
And so when they start that conversation, they may or may not know what they're looking for. And we've worked in sales. I'm not calling salespeople unscrupulous, but certainly it's an opportunity. And some of these folks signed people up and did not establish everything that needed to be in place. And the minute you start, I'm fully convinced in business, the day you pull the contract back out to look, you're already in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
You hope that the contract covers all of your parameters that you need to address and goes through things. But I watched, especially early on in Manila in the early 2000s, I watched the same thing happen in India, where I saw people often surprised at what their engagement looked like, and that they didn't account for certain costs, and they didn't account for time, and they didn't know the right metrics to ask. It's better and better and better, and now I think it's become table stakes that when an organization goes and presents to a client, they share with them, you want to come to us because we're going to account for these things and educate you along the way. That trusted advisor allows you then to actually have a true conversation about price, because now they've actually figured out how to talk apples to apples.
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't happen for the first 10 years. And I watch even here in the U.S., even with domestic outsourcing, or as people went to Canada for a period of time, that the same thing happened. And if people are ultimately just looking for the single lowest cost and playing musical countries, at some point, everybody I know that did that got bit somewhere.
Yep, exactly. So talking about, so we've talked about the different countries, the different locations. Let's talk a little bit about quality control with those different countries and also scalability. So, we talked about price. Why would someone outsource? Cost savings, scalability. So let's say a large corporation. I think you have some experience in this. Is where, let's say, a unicorn company blows up, and then all of a sudden, they have hundreds of thousands of customers wanting to connect with them and wanting to talk with them. Obviously, taking cost out of the picture, the ability to scale. Right? Who can scale the fastest and the most efficient and the best, and how do they go by doing that? Right? So sure. Let's talk a little bit about scalability, and along with scalability, quality control with that.
Yeah, scalability is fascinating. I think that many call centers built their foundations on the very fact that in the 90s and in 2000 that they exploded with the economy as things grew and as unicorn companies showed up. I was part of an organization that we went from 1,000 seats to 8,000 seats in about 9 months.
Wow.
And of course that means all hands on deck. And you start to have different conversations in the boardroom where you have questions about CapEx and you have questions about OpEx. And of course, if you can look at a contact center to help you out without having to expand your infrastructure and having to spend all that money, and you've got somebody who's willing to help you to do that, a lot of call centers exploded during that period of time.
Right.
I don't know that I could recall how many call centers really existed in 1985. I could tell you how many existed in 1995, and I could tell you how many existed in 2005 and today, and of course it's been an exponential explosion. Right. I think scalability is one of the things that is the core competency of the larger contact centers, to go back and say, I can make certain things happen. And these same organizations went through, are we going to have dark sites? Are we going to have something built ready to go that when the need comes, we'll have that ready to go? Do you want to hold on to a $100,000 a month piece of rent, real estate, knowing that you can't fill that for a period of time? Some call centers and some contact center teams have said yes. Others figured out, well, we can have people work at home and look how quickly we can expand. Now we're talking core competencies again.
Right.
Different organizations answered in different ways, and now we have hybrids where you might have a 3,000 seat center and you might still have 1,000 employees working at home. Scalability is the, I think, critical core of why somebody would look to outsource. I can't do this. I can't figure out a way to figure this out. So take these unicorn companies and just throwing in a few names over the last several years. What do you think Uber had to figure out? That's a heck of a problem.
Yeah.
And what has Facebook had to figure out? What does LinkedIn have to figure out? And as they've gone out and as they've worked with different outsourcers, they've figured out how to incorporate disaster recovery and how to get this to the right amount of people and how to get these phones answered and how to build the networks that underlie all the connectivity and all the talk. I think scalability has become the core of what a contact center is built on. And it's always a challenge that we used to see as we would have these different organizations come in, because then you have to train these people and you have to recruit these people and you have to find these people. And we've all, in contacts world, seen poor execution of scalability. Call center companies have failed on poor scalability. But I think that we've got things pretty well figured out now that we would then have strategies and plans in place for every one of those things. What are you going to do about people? What are you going to do about equipment? What are you going to do about space? What are you going to do about routing your calls? All of those things now have been figured out, and the larger some of these organizations have become, 50, 60, 70,000 agents, for crying out loud, they have the ability to go back in and solve those problems that no one else can. Something that I think has somehow impacted our industry is that because there were all those promises about scalability, there have been a lot of promises made to companies of, yeah, we're a call center, look how fast we can grow. We'll go to the Philippines and we'll be able to hire 20,000 people that speak English. They figured it out, and now they're amazing. But once upon a time, that was somebody was smoking something.
Yeah.
Today, if you go in and say, I'll hire 20,000 people in the Philippines, they went to Manila. Now they've gone to Clark Air Base. Now they've gone to Iloilo. Now they've gone to Mindanao. They'll go to all of these places, and they've now figured out how to replicate and do this again and again and again. And then they went to India, and then they went to Colombia, and then they went to, name the spot.
Name it.
Then they figured out their template and their blueprint in place. And I think with scalability, so long as you're trying to answer that as your core, you'll figure out how to do that. And with that comes quality control, because of course you've got to be able to figure out what that will look like. And I think that something that happens as people build centers, if you're making it up as you go, there's no metric.
Yeah.
So you're kind of going with your gut feel. Does this feel right to me? I've watched contact center implementation with project managers and without project managers. And I would tell any company that was going to outsource, if you can't put your person in play to be either the project manager or to sit over this with metrics that outline your success, you're about to fail. I think that so long as you have that idea where you're not going with your gut to tell you whether or not you won or lost. If you're looking at your attrition numbers and you've been told when you start, look, I'm going to have 40% of my people fall out of training. You hope that's not true. No call center company wants to go to their contracted folks and say, look, I'm going to hire 100 people, and I'm going to lose
60.
I'm going to lose 40 of them right off the bat. And anybody who's in call center is now laughing because they know that they've seen exactly this. And so when we've talked about an industry that has had sometimes 100% attrition, call center companies know how to build that in, but that's not on their deck of selling points in their slides of why they would sign that contract. So somebody has to have an honest conversation about metrics. And maybe you don't say, my attrition rate is going to be 40%. But maybe you go back and have the conversation of, I will have X amount of agents trained and capable by X date. So I think that the metrics are critical because that allows you to have an objective conversation about quality control. And one of the real benefits of outsourcing, and something that I think was a little unexpected, is that when you go to some of these foreign locations in India or wherever else where they're running workforce teams, where they're running quality teams, I came from Sears where once upon a time it was me sitting in a room with a mini tape recorder holding it up to the mouthpiece of the phone so I could record the interaction. And of course they could hear somebody breathing on the other end, like, are we being recorded? Yeah, you were. But now they've figured out with some of these great technologies, and you work with some of them, I work with some of them, where they have figured out now how to be able to bring the quantity of resources in to now execute with tools that have been fantastic. Why wouldn't you run your workforce team in India? Why wouldn't you run your contact center team or your monitoring team, your quality control teams in El Salvador? You would look at Nicaragua, because those are heavily process-based, fully understood, driven by metrics, supported by tools. That's what you pray for. That's the ideal circumstance. But for anybody who's been in the contact center world as long as I have, people have seen what it used to be like when you would go to Manila and you couldn't even find enough people to fill your seats that could speak and interact the way that you would have expected. And then at the same time, then you've got to find the best 10% of those people to monitor the other 90% as they came through.
Right.
And credit to the Philippines. What they have done is nothing short of spectacular. The investments they've made in English, but not just English, because they have gone back in, and I've seen Chinese supported, I've seen Thai supported there. The Philippines has done a wonderful job of identifying the gaps, because I think the reality is that once one person has done something, there's no reason why another can't. Whether it's Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile or a call center in the Philippines, if there was one person in the Philippines who could do this, there were more. And now to the tune of several 100,000 people that have all become very highly capable. I actually love picking up the phone when I call customer service and I get somebody in the Philippines, because I want to bring up, how's the weather, how's the traffic on EDSA. I try not to get them in trouble, but it's amazing what they have done from quality control all across the industry. And all of these third-party tools and everything else that comes to bear. They've also been able to shift that even from an enterprise level down to a small business level.
Right.
And you can now have access to tools and recording that once upon a time was $1 million that you can now add on as a service for $20 a line.
Right.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it is. One thing that I want to kind of plug in here is, it used to be where you had one or the other. You had a small mom and pop shop outsourcer that they were excellent at performance. They were excellent at attrition. They had very, very low attrition. They had highly tenured agents. Any metrics, whether it be sales, customer service, whatever it is, they would perform. And then on the other end of the spectrum is you'd have these, so going back is they'd have small number of seats, maybe 20, 50, maybe 100 seats,
Sure.
one single location, one city. But what they did is they knocked it out of the park. But they couldn't scale, right? They couldn't scale. If a large contractor came in and said, "Hey, I want to scale 1,000 seats," right? There's no way that their infrastructure was built to be able to handle that.
Yep.
And then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got kind of the larger shops where scalability, right? Scaling is what they do. You want 3,000 agents? I can have them next month. But then it was always an issue of, well, we can give you 3,000 agents, but I can't guarantee what we just talked about, the metrics, right?
Sure.
And so I think even 5 years ago, especially 10, 15 years ago, you definitely had a lot of that. But now, like you mentioned, the industry as a whole, locations as a whole, stateside, nearshore, offshore, I think the industry has done a lot better job on trying of finding a happy medium with those, being able to scale and also keep high performance, that good quality.
Well, call centers played a shell game for a period of time. So going back to those metrics that we've talked about, and as people have become more aware of what goes on, so you could go out and, again, that same story, I could hire 1,000 people, but all I can guarantee is that they're breathing. Or I can hire 1,000 people and I can say, well, they'll be trained by X date. So
Right.
people have gotten smarter to know what to ask for. And it goes also back to that level of trust as a trusted advisor. The true story would be, and I think what people have now figured out, all right, you can't get me 1,000 people that I need, but you're telling me you can get 800 high-quality trained folks. Well, this guy's promising me 1,000. I understand that,
Yeah.
but what I'm telling you is that they're not telling you that these people won't know how to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes a challenge. I give credit within the industry to the call center industry as a whole, who has gone back and they have just constantly improved. And those organizations that have been now built on and have the reputations of we scale, but we deliver with quality, will win. I've heard somebody make the statement before. We used to go to RFP, and I was part of a smaller contact center company for a period of time. And it's sometimes very hard to go and compete against the biggest dogs on the street. Hey, I'm here. I'm nipping at their heels, and I'll give them a great RFP, and I'm convinced that I can bring the highest level of service. It's really hard to be able to go back and argue against not hiring one of the biggest of dogs to protect your house when nobody gets fired for that. So, if it doesn't work out when you've hired the biggest and most successful organization on the planet, then you assume you're going to do really well. You choose IBM over, knockoff Bob's computers. It's a safe choice. But I think that contact centers, as they've developed that core and they've developed that scalability, there is room, now that those other mom and pop shops have stepped in, you have a niche market in contact centers where people have been begging for white glove, and they're out there now. Look, I'll give you your concierge service. I'll give you the white glove treatment. I'll make that stuff happen. I worked with a large credit card company while I was in Manila, and they came back to us, and everything that they did was hinged on customer satisfaction. And they weren't getting really good reviews out of the Philippines at that time. And that customer came down and said, look, here's how it'll be. I need you to tell us, as the experts, what it will take to get the score to here. Get it up. Double it. You tell us what that will take. We'll take a look at it. If we can do it, we'll do it. We went back in and we actually proposed that they nearly double salaries. And we proposed that we hired a higher level of educated resource to do what they wanted to do. They said yes. And in some ways it was almost horrifying to have them say yes, because now I've got to go prove that, I actually did what we said that I would do. So we increased salaries. We hired a different type of people. We migrated and made some changes with some of the people that we had in play that weren't working out. And it really came together, and we became, and with that organization, had just a phenomenal trusted relationship. It was one of the coolest experiences I've ever had, because I've never had a client say, here's the purse strings, go crazy.
Yeah.
It really changed the game, and it really taught me the value of how can we be as transparent as we can. How can we work with these folks to figure out, what it is that they need to deliver, what's important to them. The first question you asked me is, why should someone outsource? You should outsource if it makes you better. And if that definition of better changes over time, you should figure out what that means. So if this call center over here was only good to get you to 1,000 people, but then they can't perform, doesn't make you better. If this contact here will move slower, but will get you to where you need to be, that definition of better should always be on someone's mind. I had a great boss once in Chicago whose entire point was, my job is to make you look like an all-star. And the call center organizations that have figured that out, how to make their clients look like all-stars, they win again and again and again.
That's great. That's great. Well, Bryce, kind of shifting gears here. Obviously, we've had tons of great insight on why you should outsource. We mentioned tons of different locations, and I'm sure there'll be other episodes more specific on those locations and how to find companies to do outsourcing, for you. But let's shifting gears. You lived in the Philippines for how long? 5 years?
For 5 years.
So I had the opportunity, as we shared before. I lived in Bacolod for about 3 years, and
right.
So just for those listening, you lived in Manila.
I was in Manila, Quezon City.
Quezon City, which is in the island, Luzon, right, the northernmost island, the capital, Manila, and then so I lived in Bacolod, where it's about an hour flight south of Manila on the island of Negros Occidental is what it's called.
Yeah,
so
you had better beaches than we did.
Just a little bit, just a little bit. But like we were talking about before, it started in Manila. That's the capital. That's where probably, earlier, that's where most of the better English speaking, population lived, more technology, things like that. And now it's since expanded, talking just to name a few, Convergys, Teletech, Teleperformance, they all started in Manila. And now they've all branched out, and now they've got multiple locations in Bacolod, in Dumaguete on the same island, right across the channel there. You've got Cebu City, Iloilo. I mean, it's countless, right? So, but let's talk. So, what was your experience like in the Philippines as I don't know if you necessarily consider yourself as an expatriate, but what was it like living over offshore with your family?
So it was the very first time that I'd taken an international assignment, and I'll tell you, I still look back at that as the most fun I've ever had in my career. It was such a great experience. There's so many things that I love about the Philippines. The people are amazing. It's a beautiful country. And because we were going through such an explosion with contact centers, I got all over the place.
Right.
You'd go up to Clark Air Force Base, you'd go down to Mindanao, you'd go to Cebu. I found the people there to be just the work ethic, the willingness was something that I hadn't seen before. I told you that I started with Sears, and we did shop at home. I think that most relationships there with my coworkers were a couple, 2-3 months, and then people would move on to other things. I have friends in the Philippines that are still there 15, 17 years, after the fact, because they have found a career and a job that is exciting and appealing and wonderful. And I've loved seeing what's been happening with the industry, because it's created a new generation of leaders. And I still talk to a lot of these folks that will call and ask me, what would we do here, or how would we do it? It was great to be an expatriate during the growth period, and I'll never forget that. It's been more fun to go back over the years. It's been a year plus since I've been there last, but to still see the sky cranes in place, and to see the city exploding, and to see everything happening there. It's a country that deserves what they get, because they've put in the investment and the time, and they've done a lot of things. It's not without its problems. The Philippines can be sometimes difficult to navigate and to figure out. But I found the willingness of people there, the entrepreneurial spirit of the people, to be amazing.
Yep.
I think I mentioned this to you at one point in time, but we were there for 5 years. And when I went, my oldest son, he was 3 years old. My youngest was 1. And while we were there, we adopted a little girl who's now
That's
11.
excellent.
it's part of my heart and part of what defines me now as an individual. I consider some of the Philippine culture, I've appropriated it, right or wrong, as some of my own. And what I actually can't wait for is the opportunity to take my daughter back to her home country so that she can ultimately see, where she came from and what it was like. But I've had the opportunity since Manila to work across the world. I've spent time in South America. I've spent time all over Canada. We won't talk about how much time I've spent on an airplane, but the Philippines is close to my heart. India is close to my heart. Just amazing places, amazing people, relationships that I won't forget. Thankful every day for it.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Well, as we wrap up here, Bryce, what's, for Telarus, for you, where can people find more information on Bryce Hayes, on Telarus? What's the best places to go to?
Sure. Well, on the Telarus side, you can go to telarus.com, Telarus.com. That'll give you an idea of what we do and who we work with. And there are probably some partners out there that could benefit from the services that we have. If you'd like to introduce me, connect with me on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out. I'd love to connect, and always happy to talk about Contact Center.
Excellent. Guys, thanks for listening. This is your host, Landon Rich. You can find Call Center Crew on all the social sites. You can watch the video version on YouTube. Any of your outsourcing needs, please reach out. We'll be more than happy to educate. As our motto goes, educate, empower, and help you execute in the everyday grind that is contact centers. Thanks, guys.